Well, I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker today, Ellen Smith. Ellen is the former curator of both the American Jewish Historical Society and the National Museum of American Jewish History. She's now at Brandeis University, where she's Associate Director of the Gralla Fellows Program for Religion Journalists, and she teaches courses at Brandeis in American Jewish Women's History and American Jewish Material Culture. She is the co-editor with Jonathan Sarna of the 1995 book, The Jews of Boston, which will be released this fall by Yale University Press in paperback. Ellen was the chief historical consultant to the Emmy Award-winning 1996 WGBH television production of The Jews of Boston, and among the 30-plus exhibitions she has curated are 3 on Jewish history in Boston. So please help me welcome Ellen Smith. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. What fun. What we're going to do today in about half an hour, and then I'll leave some time for you for questions, is to take a really fast tour of the north slope of Beacon Hill from the perspective of the Jews who lived there. We're going to, in doing that, be exploring back corners and a neighborhood that is literally in the shadows of the north slope of Beacon Hill and spread into the vibrant ethnic community in the old West End across Cambridge Street. Our task is really to see the neighborhood's Jewish history in what is now a shadow of a former urban environment, to see the shadows of this history in a more well-known history, to see what has become invisible, literally what is no longer there. We're going to think about what the Jewish experience on Beacon Hill has to tell us about persistence and succession in neighborhoods, about ethnically and culturally shared spaces, and about historical memory and community renaissance. The story starts a long time ago when there are no Jews there. Boston doesn't get a Jewish community of any consequence until the 1840s, but as Samuel Sewall wrote in his seldom wholly without them. A few of them even made it onto the North Slope and the West End. And Michael Asher. They'd arrived from Boston in 1716. They set up a snuff shop, and they had a windmill down on the old South End. And they bought a piece of property behind what's now Spinnea. There they set up a shop, and they established, amazingly enough, the two of them, a site for a burial ground for the Jewish people in Boston, all 2 of them. The partnership broke up. Solomon sold his land to Asher, and then a year later they sold the land again. So by 1735 it had passed out of their hands, and yet you can trace that land until 1750. In the deeds it's still marked off having a burying ground as is now fenced to the Jewish nation. There's no evidence that anybody was ever actually buried behind Spinnea, so you can relax. And after 1750, the Jewish cemetery is never referred to again. And yet the cemetery proposed by Asher and Solomon provides the first evidence of a desire for permanence by Boston's transient Jewish community. It would be another 100 years until Boston got a permanent Jewish community, and another 2 generations beyond that before the West End and the North Slope became in part Jewish neighborhoods. But the little Jewish cemetery in the shadow of the North Slope that was never used indicated for the first time in Boston the yearning by the Jews to stay. A more visible legacy of the Jewish presence still looms over the old West End and the North Slopes, and that's the Massachusetts General Hospital. Among its earliest supporters was Abraham Touro, the son of Isaac Touro of Newport synagogue fame, who along with his brother and his sister were orphaned young and actually were raised in the North End of Boston by their aunt and uncle Rachel and Moses Hayes. As an adult, Abraham Touro became a successful merchant and shipbuilder, and he supported a variety of civic causes throughout the city. In 1816, he headed up a fundraising drive for the emerging Massachusetts General Hospital, and when he died unexpectedly in 1822, he left $5,000 to that institution, an amount that a descendant later recalled barely took the breath away of that organization. Abraham Thoreau's portrait by Gilbert Stuart still hangs at the hospital to this day. In 1854, Abraham's brother Judah likewise bequeathed $5,000 to the Massachusetts General Hospital. This time, the MGH trustees voted a resolution, and I'm quoting, that says, "In accepting the legacy of the late Judah Thoreau, we recognize in it an act prompted by fraternal love and a philanthropy not confined within the narrow bounds of time, place, or sect." But despite the legacies, both visible and invisible, from the colonial period through most of the 19th century, the Jewish presence on Beacon Hill and the West End was virtually non-existent. Its early memory buried in forgotten land deeds and once proud resolutions. Then, at the end of the 19th century, their presence exploded in ways that would help change the very physical and cultural character of Boston itself. At the end of the 19th century, beginning slowly in the 1870s and gathering steam in the 1880s and 90s, continuing through the beginning of the First World War, an enormous emigration of Jews from Eastern and Central Europe occurred in the United States, perhaps between 2.5 to 3 million people. In Boston, they arrived in numbers virtually equal to the arriving Italian immigrants, supplemented by continuing Irish immigration and the arrival of other ethnic groups new to the city. Though a few thousand Central European Jews had settled in Boston in the middle of the 19th century, and they lived primarily in the Old South End across from the weighing center, the arrival of the Jews in such large numbers at the end of the 19th century finally made them genuine players in the new ethnic mix that would come to define and redefine Boston. Mostly these Jewish immigrants settled in 3 districts: the North End, Chelsea and the adjoining communities above the Mystic River, and in their largest numbers in the West End. By 1900, the West End was so crowded that the immigrants began to spill across Cambridge Street and climb back up the north slope of Beacon Hill, where they joined African Americans, Irish, and British Americans. Here's just a quick sense of those numbers. It's an astonishing geometry. In 1860, perhaps there were 1,000 to 2,000 Jews in Boston. In 1880, 4,000 to 5,000. By 1895, there were 20,000 Jews in Boston. By 1900, it had doubled to 40,000. In 1910, there were 65,000, with approximately 100,000 Jews in the metropolitan area. And by 1920, there were 80,000 Jews in Boston and about 130,000 in the region. That density is even more evident if you look at the numbers just in the North and the West Ends. In 1880, the census said there were 125 Italians and 100 Jews in the West End, and less than 100 Italians and a few hundred Jews in the North End. By 1895, there were 7,700 Italians in the North End and about 6,200 Jews, and in the West End, about 1,100 Italian immigrants and 6,300 Jews. 10 years later, in 1905, there were 17,000 Jews in the West End alone, the largest Jewish population in any district in Boston. And in 1910, the number seems to have peaked with about 24,000 Jews just on the North Slope and the West End. Who were all these people? Primarily, they would call themselves landsmen, a Yiddish word describing people, men from the same community in Europe who, as with so many immigrant groups, came together in chain migrations or families and tried to reconnect in America with people from their old world. But the Jewish emigration is distinct in a particular way. Not just men, but also women and children came from the very beginning in this migration. Throughout this period, up to 43% of the migrants were women. This is an historically distinguishing trait of Jewish immigration to the United States and quite different than any other immigrant group, which tended to send young men, single men ahead first, some of whom intended to return. On that end, Jewish migration to Boston and America is unique in a second way. Jews who come to America generally came to stay. While most migrants to America ended up staying, not all declared that was their intention. They would come to raise money, to send money home, eventually to return, whether or not they did. Jews were under no illusion. By and large, they were leaving because they were forced out and had no plan to return. Therefore, they were more ready, they were very willing to sink their roots quickly, to change their culture quickly, to accommodate the land that they declared was now going to be their home. They came poor, but generally not impoverished, and as in Europe, the women and the children were experienced in commercial activity and in work. It was a fragile existence, but it involved general upward mobility that was fairly steady within the first and second immigrant generations. Because of this tenacity, because of this upward mobility, these immigrants had an enormous impact on the landscape of Boston. In the immigrant era, the Old West End and the North Slope were understood by observers as one district. Robert A. Woods, the great settlement house worker of the early 20th century, studied the West End in 1902, and he described the Old West End to include the North Slope up to Myrtle Street. According to Wood's map, Jews were densely congregated in the eastern districts of the West End across Commercial Street, north of Causeway between Allen and Nashua Street, south of Leverett Street between Greene and Merrimack. If you don't know the Old West End, this won't help. Those streets ain't there anymore. On the North Slope, Jews congregated along streets that still are there, along Anderson between Cambridge and Phillips, on Revere Street west of Grove, on an alley behind Temple Street, and mixed with many other groups along Irving and South Russell. Yet these neighborhoods, though they're described as one, functioned fairly separately. Leonard Nimoy, the actor and the television producer and director, grew up in the West End, and when he came once to the Vilnius Shul to give a program, I told him I was sorry I had literally never seen a full episode of Star Trek and could not talk to him about that, but I could talk to him about the West End pretty much forever, and we sat in the back and talked about it for 2 hours. His take on the West End was, I never heard of the North Slope. He seems literally never to have crossed Cambridge Street, and the Vilnius Shul on the North Slope was news to him. On the other hand, if he had crossed the street, he would see up at the corner of Myrtle Street, there's a building with a canopy that says West End. They knew where they were, even if the people across Cambridge Street didn't. The numbers changed the construction of Beacon Hill itself. Robert Woods, again in 1902, wrote, "A large part of the population is huddled into old houses originally built for the use of single families. Many of the smaller tenement houses are built in rear yards and courts. There are many large newly built tenement blocks in which evil devices involved in making over old houses are perpetuated into the new." Immigrants saw these districts slightly differently. Ephraim Lizitsky, who came to Boston from Minsk, Russia, against his will as a young adolescent in love, when he found his father in Boston, was very depressed by what he saw. He described his father as walking heavily bent under a sack full of rags and bottles. His face was dark and hard, with an expression of mingled humiliation and forgiveness. Boston shocked him no less. He thought it looked and behaved Jewishly much as it had in Europe, but, he said, in Slutsk, the learned and the pious had been in the vast majority. Here in Boston, they were a small minority, and so I felt like an alien in Boston. Mary Anton, who had the good grace to join us today, her portrait is in the back there, also emigrated to Boston from Russia as a young child, but she had a different take on the West End entirely. She was allowed as a 12-year-old to return, as she said, to childhood, and she found in America nothing, as she remembered it as a young adult, nothing but joy. Her first night in America in the West End, she described little miracles, little tin cans of food. And I'm quoting her, "A queer, slippery kind of fruit which my father called a banana, but he had to give up trying to teach us how to eat it for the time being. And a curious piece of furniture called a rocking chair," which she writes, "There were 5 of us newcomers, and we found 5 different ways of getting into the American machine of perpetual motion." More to the point, she saw the West End with different eyes. She knew that it was called a slum and wrote extensively about that. But then she said, "I saw a very different picture on my introduction to Union Place. I saw 2 imposing rows of brick buildings, loftier than any dwelling I had ever seen. Brick was even on the ground for me to tread on instead of common earth or boards. Many friendly windows stood open, filled with the uncovered heads of women and children. And of course, in Europe, Jewish women would have had their heads covered. I looked up to the topmost row of windows, and my eyes were filled with the May blue of an American sky. To understand these neighborhoods, we need to see them and hear them through both sets of eyes, the insiders as well as the outsiders. The presence and the pressure of these immigrants not only changed the built landscape on Beacon Hill with the conversion of existing housing and the construction of new tenements, but it also altered the use of existing buildings. Perhaps the most compelling reuse in the West End North Slope district is the Old West Methodist Church, built in 1806 by Asher Benjamin, but recast in 1894 as the West End branch of the Boston Public Library, which it remained until 1960. Here, in one of Boston and America's great church structures, American neighbors joined immigrant children and families to read and learn and perhaps to acquire a civic faith. That was certainly the intention of the library's great leader, Fanny Goldstein, herself a Jewish immigrant. If ever there was a Bostonian in need of a worthy, well-researched biography, it is Fanny Goldstein. Born in Russia in 1888, Fanny immigrated to Boston's North End in 1900. She attended the Hancock Grammar School, took classes at Simmons and BU and Harvard, before becoming a librarian in the Boston Public Library's North End branch in 1913. In 1917, she helped organize the Saturday Evening Girls Club, a social and educational club for all immigrant children. And in 1922, she took those lessons of multicultural living and learning with her to the West End branch of the BPL. From 1922 until her retirement in 1957, Fanny Goldstein, who was the first woman to direct a branch library in the state of Massachusetts, built in the Old West Church a massive collection of books and periodicals and newspapers of interest to American immigrants. Goldstein worked to strengthen immigrant and ethnic groups' knowledge of their own heritage and to ensure that each group also knew the history and culture of each other. To that end, she pioneered Negro History Week, Jewish Music Month, Brotherhood Week, and Jewish Book Week, which later grew into the National Jewish Book Month program. Her work in developing extensive Judaic holdings in the BPL system, for a time they were second only to the Harvard University libraries, culminated in her appointment as the first woman curator of Judaica in the BPL system. Her vision that religious and ethnic groups succeed in America through knowledge and pride in themselves and knowledge and pride of their neighbors influenced generations of Bostonians and public policy makers. Hers is a long legacy, though the Jewish immigrants are long gone from that neighborhood, and the memory of Goldstein and her programs has nearly faded from active memory. But in her time, outside on the streets as well as in her library, there was a heady mixture of ethnic voices and traditions. Kathy Carmen remembered the turn-of-the-century neighborhood as a noisy mixture of so many languages it sounded like the Tower of Babel. Isaac Goldberg extended the implication. We were, he wrote, a cosmopolitan gang. There were Italians, Scotch, Irish, Bohemians, Jews, and nondescripts. We knew nothing of racial prejudice. Later, our education would be completed by our parents, and then we would learn to hate one another. And so the immigrant presence, including the Jewish immigration, not only altered the physical landscape of the North Slope and the West End, not only altered the existing structures to new physical uses, it also altered the human landscape on Beacon Hill. Not mentioned in the polyglot list quoted above is one of the North Slope and West End's most significant historic communities, the African American community. Last week you heard here some of that community's history and achievements. But the pressures of such vast numbers of new immigrants at the turn of the 19th century turned in part to disperse Boston's North Slope black community from its North Slope locations. This ethnic shift serves in many ways as a precursor for Boston neighborhoods' histories, intentions, and cooperation in the century to come. On the North Slope, that interaction came early. Robert Woods, again in 1902, wrote that in his opinion, Jews were, and I'm quoting, inured through long centuries to overcrowding and uncleanliness. and therefore, in his opinion, were more tolerant of the increasingly urban districts that the African Americans had called their home. Then he wrote, and I once got literally yelled at when I gave a talk in Spania, every hand went up and said, "My Jewish grandmother kept a very clean kitchen." So with apologies to your grandmothers, in 1902, Robert Woods wrote, "There are actually streets in the West End where, while the Jews are moving in, Negro housewives are gathering up their skirts and seeking a more spotless environment." These shifting neighborhoods raise complex issues of urban ethnic movement and displacement. Why and when people move from their places. Sometimes they move with economic advancement. Sometimes they move by choice. Sometimes they move because they feel they are being pushed out or pressured out. And sometimes they move because they are literally forced out, as was the entirety of the West End north of Cambridge Street between 1958 and 1960. The relationship in all this among historical fact and how those facts are experienced and how those stories are remembered and handed down all contribute to how ethnic groups interact in these tight, dense neighborhoods. In their neighborhood on Beacon Hill, the Jewish presence specifically helped define its new character in the early 20th century. Even among the Jews, the north and south slopes demarcated certain aspects of that community. On the fancy south slope lived Louis Brandeis on Mount Vernon Street until 1900, and then in a rented house on Otis Street until 1916. And following him, Edward Filene on 12 Otis Place, the brother of A. Lincoln Filene and the son of William Filene, who may, God willing, keep their name on their store. The institutional presence was also there. At 47 Mount Vernon Street, the Jewish Welfare Board owned a building, still standing, which during World War II ran a non-sectarian hospitality house for members of the Army and the Navy. After the war, it was sold to Zionist House and remained in their ownership until the last decade. But the most important, the most numerous, and the most distinguishing Jewish presence on Beacon Hill was along the north slope, in the immigrant neighborhoods with the immigrant shuls, the kosher butchers and grocers, the Hebrew schools, the settlement houses, the Jewish and Jewish-sponsored charitable institutions, among them the Mount Sinai Dispensary. In the shadow of MGH, founded and supported by the Jewish Turo brothers, at the turn of the 20th century, no Jewish doctors were allowed to practice. And so, Jewish patients at the MGH did not do very well. With no one who understood their language, with no kosher food available, the Jewish patients tended to fade away more quickly than they should have. So in 1902, with the strong support of MGH doctors and nurses, the Mount Sinai Dispensary was founded, first located on Chambers Street and later where it stayed until 1916 on Staniford Street. The institution cared for the sick poor of any nationality and provided more health care for immigrants than any single institution in Boston in its first 20 years. Even more visible would have been the synagogues, the great North Russell Street shul dominating the landscape north of Cambridge Street, and smaller, sometimes unknown synagogues creeping up the slope. There were many Jewish congregations, by 1900 at least 53 throughout Boston, most of them these landsmanship shuls. Perhaps there were 20 that we can count in the west end of Cambridge, on the other side of Cambridge Street, and there were at least 4 on the north slope. Some congregations met in people's homes, some rented storefronts, some purchased old churches, and one built its own building. On the north slope of Beacon Hill, 2 Landsmannschaft shuls still stand. One has a life of multiple personalities and shared history, and one uniquely survives as a rare building that was only throughout its entire life a Jewish synagogue. The African American Meeting House on Smith Court, built in 1806 by free blacks, remains the oldest standing black church in America. Here was the foundation building for much of black Boston's faith and activism in abolition, politics, education, and culture. But from 1899 to 1982, it was the home of a Jewish congregation, Anshe Leibovitz. Also worshiping in that space were 2 more Landsmannschaft shuls, Anshe Stonier and Anshe Zeitmir. Andrzej Leibowitz was one of 3 black churches on Beacon Hill in the West End purchased by the Jewish community as synagogues. The Old African Meeting House in 1899, the 12th Baptist Church on Phillips Street, purchased by the Vilna congregation, and the African Methodist Episcopal Church on North Russell Street, purchased by 1906. At the same time, both the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church and the 12th Baptist Church relocated to the Upper South End and into 2 synagogue buildings that had been built by the Central European community earlier in the 19th century. There is, as the historian Gerald Gamm says, a certain poetry to this exchanging of churches for synagogues and synagogues for churches. A certain symmetry on Beacon Hill of exchanging black institutional buildings for Jewish ones and Jewish institutions for black ones. Under pressure and by choice, the spaces changed hands, but their meaning and their purpose did not. In these places and on these streets, immigrants and outsiders created zones where they could create community and strengthen faith and identity even as they worked to find a place in larger Boston. In these buildings and streets, successor groups shared purposes and experiences even when they no longer shared the same place. The other and now lasting immigrant Jewish institution on Beacon Hill is, of course, the Vilnius Shul, now owned and interpreted by the Boston Center for Jewish Heritage. Originally organized in the 1890s, the congregation of immigrants from Vilna first met in an apartment near the North Station. In the early 20th century, they purchased the 12th Baptist Black Church on Phillips Street, and nearly inexplicably, when the city of Boston took over the site, the congregation purchased an L-shaped plot of land up the street and built a new building in 1919. This was a very strange thing to do. By 1919, the Jewish immigrant population had largely moved from the immigrant districts of the North and the West End, moving north past Chelsea, west toward Brookline and Newton, and predominantly south toward Roxbury and Dorchester. By 1918, 5 of Boston's major synagogues were already in the suburbs, 1 in Brookline and 4 in Roxbury. The North End's great synagogue, Beth Israel, on Baldwin Place, sold its building and left in 1923. Of the surviving West End synagogues, only 1 survived the urban renewal of the 1950s. The Boston Synagogue, now on Martha's Road, was consolidated from the North Russell Street Shul and the Wall Street Synagogue. Here, a sturdy community of urban and suburban Jews have worshipped in continuous succession from the West End immigrant shuls, but until the 1990s, their numbers were fairly small. Even Mount Sinai Dispensary closed its doors. Beth Israel Hospital and its allied nursing school opened on the old Townsend estate in Roxbury in 1917, and Beth Israel Hospital moved in 1928 to Brookline Street to be near Harvard Medical School, Temple Israel, and a cow pasture. But on Phillips Street, on the north slope of Beacon Hill, the Vilna congregation stayed. Its persistence goes against every historical trend of Jewish migration in America and Boston, where Jews tend to move to a new neighborhood every generation and a half. In staying, the Vilna congregation gave Beacon Hill and the Boston communities one of its greatest gifts. The Vilnius Shul is the only surviving neighborhood immigrant-era shul in Boston and one of the very few such survivals in the entire country. This last synagogue of the immigrant generation is also the last and the lasting architectural statement of those 40 years. Temple Israel, the original Temple Israel building in 1885, built on Columbus at the corner of Northampton, is the parent of all these immigrant shuls architecturally. Redolent of Central European synagogues, it has Jewish stars, it has arched windows, perhaps this is a synagogue, New England religious architecture from the Protestant churches with their bell towers and steeples, and the imitation of the neighborhood religious architecture, primarily Catholic neighborhood architecture, which is brick and sometimes blocky. Designed by Louis Weisbein, Temple Israel served as the architectural parent for immigrant shuls in Cambridge, in Lynn, in Newton, in Dorchester, and its last child, its last lookalike, is the Vilna congregation on Phillips Street. Beyond architectural perseverance, the Vilna Shul is also a story of human and ethnic perseverance. The shul never thrived after it opened its doors in 1919. Most of the district's population was gone. Leonard Nimoy, child of the West End, didn't even know it was there. But its location on the North Slope spared it from the destruction of the West End in 1958 to 1960. And its long-lived incorporators survived against all comers who wanted to raise it for a school or for housing or for parking. Worship continued there episodically into the 1980s, and the community itself used it for various meetings and as a polling place. But for a long while it sat, quietly and mainly forgotten, in the long shadow of Boston's Beacon Hill. The joy of the story is that in 1990, the Vilna Center for Jewish Heritage Incorporated, acquiring the building and restoring and interpreting it, not just as an historic site, but as an ongoing living institution of culture and learning and community. Its evolving program of exhibitions and public programs makes that legacy available to a wide audience. And in its basement and sanctuary, a newly emerging Jewish community who now live or work around Beacon Hill again study and meet and continue the great creative process defined by Fanny Goldstein nearly 100 years ago of forging a strong American identity cast of the commingled affinities of culture and faith and nation. We'll give Louis Brandeis nearly the last word here. This fine Jewish resident of Beacon Hill learned from his trips over the South Slope and down the North Slope, where he worked tirelessly on behalf of immigrants and ethnic cultures. Speaking at Faneuil Hall in 1915, Brandeis, again reaching the same conclusion that Fanny Goldstein had reached, declared, "America has always declared herself for the equality of nationalities as well as the equality of individuals. America has believed that each race had something of peculiar value which it can contribute to the attainment of those high ideals for which it is striving. America has believed that we must not only give to the immigrant the best that we have, but preserve for America the best that is in the immigrant. America has believed that in differentiation, not uniformity, lies the path of progress." Those are indeed the lessons of the Jews of Beacon Hill. Their history, now becoming more visible and more remembered, teaches us all. The Jewish history of Beacon Hill teaches us from colonial days on, through its non-existent cemetery, that newcomers long to belong, that no matter how small a minority, how much an outsider, each person and group can and will find its own meaning and connection to place, sinking roots even into the land itself. The Boston and West End Jewish history reminds us of the power of immigrants to identify and even solve their own challenges. The Jews created their own settlement houses, their own schools, their own groceries, their own medical care, their own charitable endeavors. Beacon Hill's Jewish history reminds us that even what we can't see, what is no longer visually present or materially remembered, is important, and that it is our job to realize, literally to make real, those memories and stories. The history of the Jews of Beacon Hill teaches us to understand neighborhoods as successor spaces, in the words of the MGH, not confined within the narrow bounds of time or place or sect. Even when people do not know one another in their own time, and certainly do not know each other as generations and decades change, buildings and neighborhoods continue to do the same things for which they are built, to provide people with places to gather and worship and to form community, to enable newcomers to step outside their front doors onto the streets and into new worlds, there to join, easily or uneasily, their neighbors. Neighborhoods and buildings and spaces link people in ways we usually do not acknowledge or even imagine. These neighborhoods and buildings and spaces create communities of experience and history and memory, even when we do not know we are sharing them. We can do well to learn from the Jews and all the people of the North Slope of Beacon Hill. The paths we have traveled at different times, or that have unknowingly crossed one another, are indeed the same paths that can bring us full circle and can bring us together. Thank you all very much. We have time for questions or comments.
I'm just going to ask you to use the microphone, too, so we can make sure this is recorded.
I was wondering what the current population of Jews in Boston is. You said it was 60,000 in the early 20th century.
Right.
And also what neighborhoods the Jews today
live in now. Yes, good question. The Jewish community in Boston does its own census every 10 years. For a long time, the United States Census asked religion, ethnicity. It's no longer allowed to do so. It's now very hard in this country to count heads, but the Jews count their own heads every 10 years in Boston. In 1995, they counted about 233,000 Jews in the metropolitan area. Very few of them in the boundaries of Boston itself. It appears in the last 10 years some more Jews, particularly younger Jews, are moving back into urban centers, as are young people of all kinds. But primarily, if you're looking for kind of the pedigree, the residential pedigree of the Jews of Boston, after they moved out of those immigrant neighborhoods, there was some movement north. There are Jewish communities in Peabody and Swampscott up toward Marblehead. There certainly was a movement west, Newton, Brookline, and now west, Sudbury, Acton, Wayland, boom. And south, after Roxbury and Dorchester, where about half of the Jewish community in Boston lived between 1920 and 1960. Almost one out of every two Jews lived along a 3-mile stretch from Grove Hall down to Mattapan Center. Those Jews basically continued south into Milton, Randolph. Now there's a very large Jewish community in Sharon, moving down toward Foxborough, pretty soon to Rhode Island. I don't know where they're going. But that's kind of where the Jewish community of Boston is now. The 1995 census said approximately 223,000 in the metropolitan area. There was no good count of the city of Boston itself. It was small, but as I said, I think it's growing, and in 2005 we might have better numbers.
You said that the Jews of Boston are being counted every 10 years. Mm-hmm. By what means? Nobody's ever asked me.
Oh, well, by this means. The Combined Jewish Philanthropies of Greater Boston sponsors the census. It's a random census. They've never called me either. It's a random census done by telephone, which is now problematic for all census takers because no one answers their phone, or they have their cell phones, and the census takers don't have their cell phones. I would say up till 1995, the science has been fine. All census counters are puzzling about the meaning of numbers since 1995. Other questions or thoughts? Yes, sir.
Are the Truro brothers associated with the town Truro on the Cape?
No, the question is Truro and Truro. No, the Truro on the Cape is T-R-O. In the Truro family is T-O-U-R-O. So it's a different family. But there are lots of Truro things around. In Medfield, there's the Truro Street that's named after Abraham Truro. And his brother, Judah, had moved to New Orleans. And in New Orleans, there's the Truro Infirmary. There's another Truro Street. Of course, in Newport, there's the Truro Synagogue, named after their father, who was the chazan. He wasn't a rabbi, but he was the officiator, the chanter. And the Truro brothers also funded Truro Street, the Jewish cemetery in Newport, the fence around the cemetery, the fence around the synagogue. So there's lots of visual Truro things that descends from that family.
Why do you think the Jews moved out of the West End and the North Slope around 1920? Was it for space? Because my understanding would be that there were very few in the 40s and 50s. It was mainly Italians, and they seemed to stay until the urban renewal.
That's absolutely correct. As I said, Jews in America have a very distinct migration pattern. They moved from neighborhood to neighborhood nearly every generation to generation and a half. It's primarily a function both of wanting and needing more space, a function of doing well and stably economically so that they had the money to make the move, and the fact that in most cities at the end of this immigrant era, suburban districts were opening up. In Boston, those were Roxbury, Brookline, parts of Newton. And public transportation went through as well. So there were new places to live, ways to get there, and within reason, some money to do that. The triple-deckers that we think of when we think of parts of Roxbury and Dorchester, many of those were there, but many more were built by Jewish real estatenicks to house this migrating Jewish population. And I interviewed a woman in the early 1980s from the North End whose husband had been a peddler. Literally, he had packed up every Sunday morning, walked into New Hampshire, walked all through New Hampshire, stayed in barns, came back on Friday in time for Shabbat, stayed for Shabbat, packed up Sunday morning, off he goes again. Did this his whole life. And at the end of his life, when he's retiring, as her name was Pearl, told the story, she said, I would like to retire with you. And he said, I'd like to give you a present. We've worked so hard. How about some jewelry? And her eyes twinkled. Luckily, we have this on tape. And she says, jewelry would be nice, but what about a little real estate? And that's what they did. They moved down to Roxbury and off they went. That's absolutely typical. From Roxbury, Dorchester, as I said, they moved south. And when people talk in the Roxbury, Dorchester area about Jews moving out in the face of blacks moving in, at the time that happened, by far and away the bulk of the Jewish population once again was already gone. Back to the West End, you're absolutely right. The Italians persisted. The Irish persist in their neighborhoods until fairly recently, the North End really was Italian. It's going to be very interesting and probably heartbreaking to watch what happens under the pressure now of new urban renewal. But the Irish stayed in East Boston and South Boston for 100 and more years. The Jews bump. Only in Pittsburgh, in the Squirrel Hill district, can you find an immigrant neighborhood that stayed consistent with Jewish population. Everywhere else in America, boom, they move. There's a ferocious, still very active West End reunion group. They have a newsletter. Some of those last cases, as I understand it, are still wending the way through their courts. But it's almost all the Italian people who still come together and meet and remember. And if you have people in your family who belong to this category, if you know any, if you have not taken their oral histories yet, go home right now and do it. Because if you don't, those histories will be gone, gone, gone. And it's too precious of an era to lose. Your children, your grandchildren, my students need to know about it.
By any chance, when you were interviewing Leonard Nimoy, did you ask him as to the origins of the live long and prosper thing?
Not directly, having, as I said, never seen a Star Trek episode, but of course the rumor flies, and he even wrote that he was in part inspired by having visited a Jewish cemetery. On some of the old gravestones you will see hands being held like this, which is a position of the Kohanim, in Jewish religion, the priestly blessing that is given, often is given from this posture. And he has told the story in public sometimes that is one of the sources for whatever he does in Star Trek. Live well, be strong, whatever that is. I don't think that's from the Yiddish.
Yes. What can you tell us about the influence of the Storrow family and the West End house?
Oh, wonderful question. Another full lecture. But quickly, Boston takes a unique position. What I described by Fanny Goldstein, valuing who the immigrants are, tends to be the position held by most social reformers in Boston, Jewish or Christian. The Storrows are among them. The Peabody sisters are among them. And it means that in Boston, if you follow the social work movement, you will see a lot of energy being put in various ways to preserving ethnic and immigrant identity. In other cities, the melting pot really was meant to be that. Put everybody into a school system, a vocational system, a settlement house, whatever, teach them the same language, teach them vocation, teach them the same civic lessons, and when you come out, maybe you will have an amalgamated group of people who can live together. We tend to poo-poo that now, but going forward, it was a plausible position. In Boston, the more adequate model is the one of Horace Callan, who was in the early 20th century a student at Harvard and later moved to New York. He decided being a young student at Harvard in 1905 was not a nice place for a Jewish person, so he founded what he called the Menorah Club, which was a Jewish cultural club. But Horace Callan is the person who coined the phrase cultural pluralism. He meant something slightly different than we tend to mean. But his image was not a melting pot. He said the image of the symphony is the right one, where if all these immigrant groups, all these ethnic people, all these Americans can come together on the same stage and basically follow the same conductor and follow the same sheet music, then you can be the flute and you can be the tuba and you can be the snare drum, and most of the time it will sound good. That tends to be, from the Storrow's point of view, from the Peabody sisters' point of view, from Fanny Goldstein's efforts in the library, that tends to be the undercurrent of the Boston social work approach. All right. You have time for one more question? Okay.
What you said about people moving out sounds as though it's a kind of free moving out. Now, in the present situation, right now, both in New York and certainly in Brookline, people want to stay in Brookline, right, but they can't because it's too expensive. The schools are excellent. People really want to come in, and they don't.
That's exactly
right. And that's
right.
a very sad thing because it's not for reasons of
right.
Enriching themselves. I don't mean that in money,
Yes.
So I find
yes.
that...
I agree, and you're describing the opposite pole. Sometimes people move out of neighborhoods because they feel they're forced out. Sometimes people want to leave because they're afraid. You're describing a situation where people would like to stay, but the rising economics disallow that. And that's a time when certain communities will, and federal legislation now says that you have to have a certain amount of affordable housing, so forth and so on. It's very difficult. This city has never solved that problem. It's what happened to the older Jews in Mattapan at the very end as well.
I mean, it's too bad, and there should be something done about it.
I agree.
I don't know what. Just a couple of, weren't you involved with the exhibit in Lexington of Jewish memorabilia?
Oh my goodness, yes. What a memory.
I was one of the, whatever you call them, you have somebody who guides people.
Oh, one of the docents of the tour guides?
I also had my mother's Betgevant holder.
What is your name? What is your name?
Shalomit Peck.
Oh my goodness, yes, yeah. She was one of our researchers. Oh, how nice to see you.
Betgevant holder means a bride would come from Europe with her perino, which was a quilt that she had assembled with her friends, her mother, out of feathers, and I still have it.
Oh, how wonderful!
She had something she had embroidered, which on it was embroidered Mazel Tov, meaning good luck, and there were handles on it, so you put the feather thing in and you held it. Right. And that was part of it. I wondered if that could whether you were going to do another exhibit.
Couldn't be done like that. Shalomit is talking about in 1980 a show that I was a very young thing, curated on the history of the Jews of Boston. We had a wonderful designer and they couldn't invent enough prizes to give it. And it was a wonderful show. It proved to me very early in my life two things. If you give an ethnic show, people will come. That was in 1980 when the Museum of National Heritage had its 25th anniversary. They called me and invited me back to be the keynote speaker in the entire series of celebration that year because that exhibition on Jewish Boston was still the largest attended exhibition they had ever put on in their 25 years. Last year I did a show in Seattle on Seattle Jewish women 75 years or older. We did their oral history, we took their portraits. It was a gorgeous show. We did not do that like this show in a Jewish institution. We did it in a public institution, the largest attendance they'd ever had at that museum in Seattle. There is great hunger, great interest, great commitment to these kinds of exhibitions and these stories. Once again, if you don't have your family stories, go get them. Give them to an historical society, give them to your children, but just get them. Thank you very much.